Hello, and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
I wanted to start this week's episode by speaking about people who in local politics certainly are my recurring nemesis, but to actually think about them in their current national context. And that is the traditional third party in Britain, certainly in the vast majority of the 20th century, the Liberals, or now the Liberal Democrats. Part of what made me think about this week is that really for the first time in this parliament, there were some journalistic rumblings in the past week that suggested that Ed Davey may not be leader of the Liberal Democrats going into the next general election, partly because their polling position seems rather poor. There was a poll this week that had them on just 9% of the national vote, but also because there is a sense among a lot of Lib Dem MPs, apparently, that Ed Davey has taken the party as far as he can take it. Though what he has managed to do is a few things, all of which are very impressive, to be fair, or certainly some of which are very impressive. He's managed to oversee a Lib Dem operation that was incredibly well targeted at the 2024 general election, and managed to do something really which is almost without precedence, I actually think, in British politics. He led the party to fewer votes in 2024 than the Lib Dems got in 2019, fewer votes across the UK, but from around a dozen seats to 72. Been a remarkable electoral achievement of efficiently maximising what Lib Dem votes can get you in terms of parliamentary seats. So he's managed to do that. He's managed to occasionally capture media attention, but usually with gimmickry, if we're honest with ourselves. He's in a wetsuit in the Lake District or whatever. He would claim, and I'm sure his defenders would claim, there is often a serious point behind what he's trying to do. But I think most of the country think it's rather gimmicky. And he has managed to integrate, I think, relatively effectively, the new Lib Dem parliamentary intake, some of whom are very impressive, into the party and the framework of the Liberal Democrats. The challenge now, though, really, if you're a Lib Dem, I would think, is to say, well, how do we come up with a national policy offer that is coherent and appealing at the UK-wide level? How do you elevate other people in the party to looking like they are credible members of a potential government, especially if we are, as it does now seem to be the case, now a multi-party political system in which a hung parliament is a perfectly plausible outcome of the next general election? And of course, to maximise where the Lib Dems will be in that, how do you actually try and boost their polling? Now, their polling performance is currently really quite weak. How do they try and maximise that? My reading of the situation is that Ed Davey is not especially well equipped to do any of those things. I don't doubt he's a decent person. He does certainly seem to be a decent person, but he doesn't seem to be able to come up with a very compelling or coherent policy agenda. The only two things I've ever really heard him talk about are social care to some degree, which is a probably noble thing to take on as an issue, but it's not actually obvious what he thinks should be done about it. It's just more of a sense that actually the Lib Dems are serious about getting into the weeds of a policy issue that recently the two major parties have not wanted to touch for fear of it detonating in their hands. And of course, he has been quite anti-Trump as well. Something which actually I think somewhat jars with the point about social care, because I think when Ed Davey's spoken about social care policy in the past, that's rather faded down the agenda from what I can see. He's done so as a serious, weighty politician, but then his response to the Trump situation is to say, oh, well, I'm just not turning up to the state dinner, as if realistically boycotting events with the President of the United States is actually a serious proposal for government, right? It's just not. It's just not a serious thing to do. All of which is to say, my feeling is that Ed Davey probably has taken the Lib Dems about as far as they can go. And whilst there may be some gratitude to him for the fact that he helped lead the party to having this really very largest in a century, Liberal parliamentary party, I actually think level-headed Lib Dem MPs ought to start to think about what happens next. And I'll end on this note, that What happens next for most of them is really a choice between, do they simply want to be what Lib Dem MPs often manage to be, which is highly regarded local constituency MPs who are simply trying to maximise their incumbency advantage in their own seat? Or do they want to try and be members of parliament of genuine national significance? People who are known and associated with major areas of challenge or major policies. If they want to just be the former, then they can only stick with where they are. If they actually want the Lib Dems to be a big substantive party in British politics again, then I think the party has to start moving on to its next phase.
A few things to pick up on, Lee. I suppose I approach this from the opposite end, but with a similar set of conclusions, in that I've always seen the Lib Dems as probably my chief political adversary in British politics. I think the party that I'd be least likely to ever vote for in a general election would be the Liberal Democrats. Some of that may have been formed by the fact that the constituencies where I first became politically active in this country, Cambridge and Bedford, had significant Lib Dem local presence, which often shaped the way that I perceived that party as being a completely scurrilous and toxic force in our politics. Party that attracted people who were extraordinarily sanctimonious, deceitful, and often offered little in terms of productive policy ideas, but were there to take advantage of people's frustrations with the other parties. So I don't think very highly of them, if that wasn't clear already. Nor do I think very highly of their leader, Ed Davey, or should I say Sir Ed Davey, knighted for his services to a Conservative-led government in which he was a minister. This is a man who is implicated in the horrible post office scandal, which saw many innocent people have their lives ruined, and for which, of course, he wasn't solely responsible, but we can look back and say that action wasn't taken when he was in charge, when he was a minister, and that cost people very dearly. In terms of what he's tried to do with these gimmicks and stunts, of course, it's very difficult for a minor opposition party to gain media attention, so he's been successful in doing that. But I actually think there's a darker side to it, which is that these silly stunts are an effort for Davey to sanitize his political image. It's an attempt to try to get him known for jet skiing and hang gliding and dad dancing, rather than being known for being a minister in a government that ruined people's lives. So I don't laugh when I see him doing his gimmicks. I think there's something much more sinister at play. Now, in terms of the future of the Lib Dems, what might we say? We need to think, I think, what is the unique selling point of this party? And I think it doesn't look great for them. One of their unique selling points, I suppose, was that they were the default protest party in British politics for a long time. If you were fed up with Labour or the Conservatives, then you could vote Lib Dem. It's the way that really the Liberals have operated since Jeremy Thorpe in the 1970s. They were the party that capitalised on discontent with the two main parties. They were the none of the above choice on the ballot. And now that space is rather crowded. The rise of the Greens gives a certain group in the electorate an opportunity to cast a protest vote for a party that might have more current attractions about them, whether that's the party's positions on climate and that being of the moment, or on Israel, Palestine. It's a protest vote with some positive reasons for voting for them. I actually think the rise of reform has been quite bad for the Liberal Democrats, because there is, although it's not sort of thought of very much in this way, there is a group in the electorate who could go from voting Lib Dem at the last election to reform at the next election, because they're voting for the most prominent protest vote in their area. And part of my evidence for this is that back in 2010, when the Lib Dems did very well in that general election under Nick Clegg, one of the top policy issues for people who voted Lib Dem in 2010 was immigration, and they wanted to bring down immigration. And this wasn't because they had a sort of view of what the Lib Dems policy program was, but they were grumpy with Labour over what they perceived at the time as not handling the immigration issue very well. And the Lib Dems were a way of giving the incumbent party a bloody nose. And now I think with reform, there's a more powerful force to that. I also think the rise of reform is bad for the Lib Dems because it helps to detoxify the Conservative Party. For people who voted Lib Dem last time who were historic Tory voters, the removal of some of the more controversial figures in the Conservative Party into reform, I think helps make the Conservatives become a more attractive option for those voters again. A second unique selling point of the Lib Dems historically was this, as you've discussed, Lee, this sort of hyper-local campaigning activity, where basically Lib Dem councillors and MPs pretend like they have no politics. They pretend like they aren't driven by particular ideology or principle. They just want to be nice people doing a good job and serving their fellow man and woman. One can question whether that is in fact the case, but part of the problem I think that the Lib Dems have with that now is all of the parties claim to do this basically, and that we've seen some people talk about the Lib Demification of British politics. And so that no longer stands out, I think, the Lib Dems, both locally and nationally, in the way that it perhaps once did. Pavement politics is now not unique to the Liberal Democrats. And the final unique selling point of the Lib Dems, one might say, is liberalism and the historic tradition of liberalism and the ideology of liberalism in British politics. And on that, I think they have some problems. One is that I think the party itself has been inconsistent in attaching itself to those traditions of liberalism and really sort of staking out a claim as to what those ideals mean in terms of policy, in a way in which, like 20 years ago, when we were first getting involved in politics, a lot of people I spoke to who were pro-Lib Dem, these students I knew at Cambridge, they always go on about civil liberties and 90-day detention and torture and all these different things. And it was a way in which they could basically use a critique of the Labour government's approach to the Iraq War and the War on Terror to also pitch into this bigger tradition of liberalism. I think the party hasn't been able to do that recently in a very clear and consistent way. And the second thing I'd say on liberalism as an ideology is that the Liberal Democrats have suffered in some ways from the cultural success of liberalism in infecting, in my view, the other parties. I think that in a way in which, again, even 20 years ago, it was very clear to me if I met a Labour councillor and a Liberal Democrat councillor, that they would have quite a different way of thinking about social issues. Not universally, but sort of the median in both. Now they feel very similar. And so part of that is about the way in which cultural liberalism has really taken over, or the way in which certain elements of social liberalism, and dare I say economic liberalism, have taken over in the Labour Party, that I think now means, again, it's not so clear what is a liberal approach to British politics that's unique to the Liberal Democrats. Rant over for now.
Well, a few things I wanted to come back on that. If we're to be a little bit more generous towards Ed Davey, at least in one sense, of course, he got his knighthood for an occasion in which the Liberal Democrats had to answer some of the most basic questions in politics, which they often don't have to answer. And that is about how do we govern the nation and what are the actual policy decisions that we're going to implement and going to be responsible for. Of course, back in 2010, the arrangement that took them into making those decisions was a coalition with the Conservatives. And so if to govern is to choose, when the Lib Dems last made a choice about how they would govern the country, it almost killed the party. And in fact, Ed Davey lost his own seat in the 2015 election before coming back shortly afterwards. And I think in part, you can see this flippancy with Davey now that comes into his politics. I think in part it is because, sure, he got the knighthood for his 5 years of serious grafting in government, but the outcome of that electorally was appalling for the Liberal Democrats. And therefore that I think they're rather happier now not having to make those big choices. But the next general election result may force them onto them anyway. On your point about liberalism, I agree with that there was a strand, but there is a strand of libertarian thinking in this country. And historically, a big chunk of that sat within the Lib Dems. So there are some people now who are more conservative or reform aligned who historically have been in the Liberal Democrats. So Mark Littlewood, the political commentator and who runs PopCon, the Popular Conservatism group, he is a former Liberal Democrat because he has basically got quite libertarian politics. And of course, what's put him off the Liberal Democrats is the fact that they appear as a party to have moved away from lots of the things that libertarians or smaller liberals would have historically been attracted to. I mean, if you think of a big one and then a small parochial one, a big one might be seen as, well, desiring to have this entire extra level of governance at the European level, which has been such a major issue for the Lib Dems in recent years, wanting to be in and then get back into or cancel the departure from the European Union. There are plenty of people who may be liberals who think, well, actually, if we are broadly skeptical of the state doing things and interfering in people's lives, why would we want to have this pan-European superstate as well as national government and local government? That's not really an argument you hear within the Lib Dems now, but it'd be a perfectly coherent argument, I think, for Liberals to make. If we parochialise it massively to where we live, the Liberal Democrats who run Oxfordshire County Council have recently introduced a means by which you have to fill in a 5-page booking form if you want to take a bag of garden waste to the tip. If the idea is that government should tread lightly on people, or at least if that's part of the Liberal agenda, well, actually, the Lib Dems, when they actually do get in charge of things like local government, often find themselves creating additional bureaucracies and burdens on residents, which there would be some Liberals in the country who would rather resent. When you started out your points, you made a comment about the rise of the Greens, for example, and it is just, if we zoom out, rather extraordinary that in this country we have the traditional two big parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, both polling around half, if not less than half, of what they have at different times in the last 5 or so years. We think about the time when the Conservative Party was polling in the 40s under Boris Johnson, not all that long ago. The Labour Party polling in the 40s, not at the general election, but in the lead up to the general election under Keir Starmer's leadership. Both of those parties are way down in the opinion polls compared to where they were. But the Liberal Democrats are not benefiting from that. They're benefiting from it indirectly, in the sense that in lots of constituencies under first past the post, a system they historically loathe, if they're able to keep hold of their vote share whilst Labour splinters with the Greens and the Conservatives splinter with Reform, then that can help the Lib Dems win elections. But they're not benefiting from that in terms of net votes, it appears. People are not being attracted to the Lib Dems in spite of the fact that they're being, in the last half decade or so, repelled by the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. That is something we could come to look back on as being a generational failure for the Liberal Democrats at this moment in time. And I think, just to finish my thoughts on this, I think of the 72 Lib Dem MPs there are at the moment, some of whom are very ambitious and, as I said before, to be generous to them, pretty capable people. I don't think they're going to want to settle just for that. And I actually think it would be, if I'm honest, an act of cowardice for the Liberal Democrat Parliamentary Party to stick with what seems to be quite a limited leadership offer from Ed Davey and not find a way to move on from that between now and the next general election. Richard, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, my matter of interest this week comes from a topic that I'm currently teaching in my master's course on US public policy, but I think it's potentially relevant to a British politics discussion as well. And that is the rather unglamorous sounding topic of interjurisdictional policy diffusion. Basically, what we're talking about here is the spread of policies implemented in one jurisdiction to others. In US public policy, one way of thinking about this is through two models of policy diffusion. One is called the California effect, and the other is called the Delaware effect. So the idea behind the California effect is that if there is a jurisdiction that is of a sufficient size, the desire for particularly firms to sell to that jurisdiction, allow that particular jurisdiction to set the standards for all of the other jurisdictions that are in that nation or single market. Okay, so like the California example is that California's Air Standards Authority sets state level vehicle emission standards. But given that California is a state of nearly 40 million people, and it's an enormous market for selling cars, if California sets quite a high vehicle emission standard, auto companies in the United States or foreign companies that sell to the United States will work towards California's high level and basically treat the California standard as the floor for the whole nation, because it's inefficient for them to create a high standard car for California and then a lower standard car for South Carolina. Another example is that it's sometimes argued that school textbooks, or at least this, I don't know if things have changed. I don't even know if people use textbooks at school now, but school textbooks in America would sometimes be written in ways so as not to fall afoul of the Texas State Education Authority's requirements relating to evolution and the ways of teaching that. And this would basically be like the Texas textbook effect, where because Texas is such a large state with a huge population, school population, that if you're going to write biology textbooks, then you're not going to do a special set for Texas, but you will write them in a way that's Texas friendly and then sell them to the rest of the country, which might mean evading certain discussions. I'm not sure. I haven't looked this up. I'm not sure if it's evolution or if it was some other element of sexual morality or something like that. But that's the basic gist of it. Now, thinking about the UK, we might say that we have a bit of a California effect when it comes to English policy versus devolved policies, where effectively the English regulatory standard becomes de facto the UK-wide regulatory standard because England is such a large part of the British market. And one example I think that sort of could fit in this is when England changed its regulations relating to dangerous dogs. So when the UK Parliament, legislating just for England, or I think maybe England and Wales, banned XL bully dogs, this then basically forced Scotland to change its dog regulations to meet the English ones, because having those different standards would basically encourage the sort of proliferation of these dogs in Scotland. At the EU level, we could think about the fact that even though we're outside of the EU, Britain still it gets caught up in many elements of the EU regulatory orbit because it's cheaper for companies to produce products that align with EU standards rather than make a special Great Britain product. You mentioned when we were talking about this a moment ago, the bottle caps and how in Britain today now you have these bottle caps that are attached to the plastic bottles so that they don't fall off and get swallowed by seals or whatever it is. Another example, I think, is food labeling. So now that we're out of the EU, we would no longer need to use metric labeling on our food and drink. And yet, pretty much, I think all food and drink labels in Britain, at least as anecdotally, contains metric labeling. Now, maybe part of that is consumer preference, But also, I think it's because it may be for some producers inefficient to sort of have different sets of information on their GDPR, the privacy regulations. It becomes costly for businesses to operate differently. So in a way, I think people who voted to leave, particularly those who were motivated not really for the reasons that I was, but for more for the right wing anti-regulatory reasons, get quite grumpy about these things. Of course, my point would be we don't have to go along with these market forces, right? We could force companies to adopt different behavior and to sell different bespoke products to us, but there are costs associated with that. My point is that those costs are not necessarily good, but they're not necessarily intolerable either, and that they should be a democratic choice for us to make, whether we're willing to bear those costs or not. So that's the California effect. The Delaware effect is where firms exploit regulatory difference to lower costs in a way that effectively works to undercut other jurisdictions. So the reason it's called the Delaware effect is that in the United States, Delaware has very low corporate tax, has very low corporate taxes, and has a very business-friendly state regulatory environment. It has a state court system which is set up in a way that basically tends to favor firms over consumers and that sort of thing. And an astonishing number of American companies are incorporated in Delaware, this tiny sort of odd state, sort of just adjacent to Maryland, and that's the reason why. So where the California effect, I suppose, is really about one big market or one big entity kind of forcing the other ones to raise their standards, even if they haven't chosen to do so. The Delaware effect is about how a smaller unit can exploit jurisdictional differences to force other jurisdictions to lower their standards. So other examples might be in the United States, there's been a trend of states lowering their trade union protections to attract businesses to set up operations in their state. So, for example, a couple of decades ago, Tennessee made use of the fact that it has very weak trade union laws to attract auto firms to relocate from Michigan, where Detroit is famous for the car manufacturing, to attract them to go from Michigan down to Tennessee because of the looser labor rules. Or you might think of, in the EU context, how Ireland basically becomes a sort of Delaware, where its very low corporate tax rate becomes a way in which it sucks out firms from operating in other parts of the EU, for example, by headquartering themselves or incorporating themselves in Dublin. Now, I would say to that, we don't have to accept the Delaware effect necessarily. It can be sometimes challenging to respond to, but there are ways in which you can respond to it where you basically punish firms that do exploit these interjurisdictional differences, or where you incentivize companies to operate in your jurisdiction. So that may be by saying that we will reward companies that are based in Britain with preference for government contracts, whereas those that are based in Dublin or those that are based in Monaco, for tax reasons, they get put to the back of the queue for government contracts or something like that. You could do these are so. The point of the California and Delaware effects is not to say that they're sort of these immutable, unchallengeable laws of economics that can never be evaded, but they are tendencies that governments have to contend with, and there are costs and choices that have to be made around them.
One aspect of it I did want to comment on is whether or not, when you have within a country or within some sort of supranational model, the ability for different polities or policy writing bodies to determine their own way and their own policies and their own agenda? Do these act as experimental laboratories that have positive or negative effects on others, which I guess is in part what this is all talking about? And it does seem to me as if there are ways in which that happens where they raise the burdens, the Californian example you gave, and other people feel they have to comply with them, or where they create incentives, basically. Then there is a big rush to try and benefit from those incentives. In the British case study, I think what we've almost always had is localized or devolved policymaking, basically creating additional burdens rather than additional opportunities. If we take the examples of devolved governments in the UK, came into effect in the late 1990s, have almost always had social democratic leadership. So the Welsh Parliament, formerly the Assembly, now typically called the Senate, has always been in Labour hands in terms of its leadership. That does seem likely to change this May. We'll soon find out. Up in Scotland, it's often been Labour-led and then in the hands of the SNP. And they have not been interested in either case in trying to say, well, actually, how do we cut the regulations? How do we cut the taxes in our part of the UK to try and attract additional investment, more businesses, whatever the case may be? An exception to that, as it happens, I think would have been if there'd been an independent Scotland and Alex Salmond had been Prime Minister of it. I think he was much more interested in looking at the way in which small countries have succeeded economically and may have been more willing to experiment with those things. So I think what we've not seen in the UK is almost anything on that side, really, in terms of how do we try and incentivize economic activity and create benefits for the local area. What we do see really is experimentation with the burdens that are put on people. And I mentioned in passing before, again, to hyper-parochialize this about rules for going to the local tip. I mean, one of the things that's happened in lots of parts of the UK is that local authorities have begun to say that if you want to go to the tip, you need to prove that you live in the county that provides that facility, the household waste recycling centre, as councils insist on calling what everybody else calls tips. And of course, in each individual case, there may be people who think that sounds perfectly reasonable, but what it does is it creates a bureaucratic burden on everybody who lives in all these counties that demand it. Once one does it, a neighbouring authority will say, well, we're suffering if we don't do this because people are crossing the border to use our tips, but people can't cross in the other direction. And you end up getting this ratchet of bureaucracy and burdens on members of the public, which is really difficult to then unwind. It's really difficult to win the political argument, I think, to unwind it in terms of the people who often run these councils. It's something that actually in the week before this podcast comes out, I'll be doing in County Hall in Oxford, trying to argue for this ratchet to be wound down, if you can do such a thing, to try and ease the burdens on residents. The exception that you hinted at before, which has never been realised, is the one of Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland's desire, or some people in Northern Ireland's desire, to have a corporation tax rate that matches the Republic of Ireland, because they think that would be economically advantageous for the 6 counties of Northern Ireland to go down to 12.5% corporation tax. I dare say it would. What it would almost certainly mean, though, I think, is that every British company would suddenly register themselves as being in Northern Ireland, if at all possible. Now, that may not be a bad thing, because then maybe the United Kingdom would become the Delaware of the European continent in terms of attracting lots more businesses. And maybe it would pull the rug from underneath the Republic of Ireland, which has, as you said, basically operated as a tax haven on the European continent for big American multinational corporations.
Use this term of these subnational jurisdictions acting as laboratories. And of course, this is one of the arguments that's made in favor of devolving policy-making responsibility to subnational units. A sort of grand term that's used in America that goes back to the Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis to call states laboratories of democracy. I have all kinds of objections to devolution from an egalitarian perspective, but I'll park those. I've aired them in this podcast before. I'm sure I'll air them again. But just in terms of how that works, I think it's just it's worth reflecting on for a moment. So part of the idea here is that policy diffusion happens through policy learning. So you see a different state or nation or county has tried a policy and it's had these beneficial effects, and so you decide that you're going to adopt that policy. Some public policy scholars say, well, actually, policymakers look actually more to learn about the politics of a policy than the policy outcomes of a policy. What I mean by that is they look to see if there's good politics associated with the implementation of the policy or bad political reaction from it. And that shapes the willingness of them to adopt that policy. So with your much front of mind issue for you, Lee, this issue about tips, if a county sees that adding burden to going to the tips leads to increased fly tipping, that might be policy learning. Irrespective of that, if people get annoyed by the fact of having to fill out this 5-page form each time they want to go to the tip, does that create a political backlash, which might in itself outweigh the policy benefits of shorter queues in tips or closing down tips, which I assume is behind the Lib Dems approach here as another drive by the Lib Dems to shrink the public realm. Sometimes it's talked about how some jurisdictions are more innovative than others, and some jurisdictions act as effectively kind of free riders. So the idea here is that some places are less experimental. They allow other jurisdictions to try a new policy, and then they wait and see if it works or not. And of course, the benefit from the wait and see jurisdiction is that they don't have to bear the costs of policy failure. They may lose some of the benefits of being a first mover in a policy area, but those benefits are not always there with a particular policy. And then another thing just to think about, one last thing just to think about, is what we call policy feedback, where once you implement a policy, it creates a kind of virtuous cycle where the deepening of that policy or the diffusion of that policy becomes easier. So a couple of quick examples. In the United States, it's been noted that the fact that some US states have very favorable trade union regulations relating to teachers' unions has enabled teachers' unions to have very high density in some states. Like in some states, 80 to 90% of teachers are in the union. And that then enables them to have a big pot of money for the union that can then be spent on campaigning and lobbying in states that don't have favorable laws relating to teachers' unions to try to get those states to change the laws. And basically, they're being resourced by the other jurisdictions that have more favorable laws. Or another example is like clean energy, where if some states have very favorable clean energy regulations that enable firms to build up a market in those states, then those companies can use the profits from those states to try to get more favorable terms in other states using the resources that they're getting from the other ones. So they get what's sometimes called a policy beachhead. They sort of get in one place so that they can move into another. So these things all excite public policy scholars. They're quite interesting. I think, just to go back to a point I made earlier, I think it's important to understand that these are not unchallengeable. These are tendencies, these are incentives, these are informal rules and structures that exist. But ultimately, we, in my view, as a population, as a demos in a democracy, we have to make choices about what our responses are to those things and to push back against those tendencies where we don't think they're serving us, and to ride the waves when we do think those tendencies are serving us.
Final thought from me on that is when we're thinking of varying policies as experimental and laboratories, one of the key questions is who is measuring the consequences? How do they measure them? And what do they think good or bad looks like? Now, that rather gets to the heart of the point you were just making then about them being challengeable. I think part of the problem that I often see is that if we imagine the people who are, this isn't a generalized attack, but senior civil servants or senior in local government in lots of parts of the United Kingdom, things that they may think are desirable are not necessarily the things that the wider public will think of as being desirable. And one of the things that very rarely gets a hearing, really, in these debates is actually just public satisfaction levels. And I actually think a big problem that we have is trying to make sure that the public's voice and actual public preferences are heard in policy making and appraising varying approaches to policy making. And just a final comment is that whenever the UK government comes with a policy idea, they will often consult on it. And if you look at who it is who puts into the consultation, really well represented are lobbying groups, campaigning charities, trade unions, all groups with a vested interest, and usually quite a sectional interest about a particular policy area. And they then get heard high up the British state, and they get to influence the policy. Just the ordinary views of the British public are often much harder to discern, I admit, but also much less commonly heard where they do need to be heard. And actually, if we're going to tackle this related phenomena of people being deeply dissatisfied with government and how it works, we do need to fundamentally try and make sure that people's voices are heard where the decisions are made. That's all for this midweek episode of Since Attlee and Churchill. We'll be back on Sunday with the second part of our latest mini-series on the Wilson to Callaghan transition of power in 1976. And this time we'll be looking at what I do think is probably the most impressive leadership election of the post-war era, certainly on the Labour side. And that's the race to replace Harold Wilson, which, spoiler alert, was ultimately won by Jim Callaghan. But how we got to the top, I think, is one of the most fascinating stories that we really want to tell on the podcast. That will be out on Sunday, and we'll see you then.
Thanks very much.